Hello, friends! Getting served with a domestic violence injunction during a divorce case can be staggering. It could literally leave you breathless. You hear a knock on the front door, you open it, you see a police officer there or someone from the sheriff's office. They hand you the injunction paperwork, and you're sitting there looking at it in disbelief, thinking to yourself, well, what am I supposed to do next? How am I supposed to act? What are the things that I need to avoid doing immediately? Well, on today's video, we are going to discuss the 5 critical do's as well as the 5 major don'ts that will make or break your case in the event you get served with an injunction during a divorce proceeding. Welcome back to the Divorce Broadcast. My name is Manny Segarra, coming to you from Miami, Florida. Alright, so as many of you who watch this channel on a regular basis already know, courts take domestic violence allegations very seriously. A lot of the jurisdictions have or consider domestic violence in some of the factors for time sharing or for visitation with children. I'd like to drop a quick statistic, and that is according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, over 20,000 phone calls are made to domestic violence hotlines every single day in our country, in the United States. But what happens when an injunction is filed against somebody in a divorce case or in a high conflict divorce case? Well, the person who had the injunction filed against them, they need a plan, and they need one quick. Therefore, we are going to jump into the 5 things that a person who is served with a domestic violence injunction during a divorce case must consider doing immediately. And when I say immediately, it means right now. Go do this. The first is do read and try to understand what is in the injunction. The injunction paperwork, it's usually a packet. Make sure to read the injunction line by line. You shouldn't be skimming this information because there's a lot of important stuff on there. For instance, does the injunction include a no contact provision? The person can no longer have contact with their spouse. Does the injunction require the person to literally leave the home that they are reading the injunction inside of? If it does, pack up their bags and get out. Does the injunction have a prohibition of going to the children's daycare or school? It's very important to be aware of that. Does the injunction set forth all types of communication that are prohibited? Is it not only phone calls and text messages and emails, but does it include social media and other forms of communication? All of this information is usually contained in the injunction. It is important to read and understand what the injunction says. Number 2 on the must-do list is do obey the restrictions on the injunction, even if you don't think that they're fair and even if you don't like them. Why do I say this? Because violating an injunction can lead to criminal charges. In a lot of jurisdictions, I know in the state of Florida, if you violate an injunction for protection against domestic violence, the police can arrest you for it. It's a first-degree misdemeanor here in Florida. It can rise to the level of a felony if there are multiple violations of the injunction. So, if the injunction says you cannot contact your spouse, don't do it. Even if you are trying to send a text message to try to explain yourself, that can land you in jail. If you send a birthday card or a birthday message to the child, this can also get you in trouble if the injunction prohibits any contact with the spouse or the children. Or a wife who sends a text message to her husband who has an injunction against her, asking about mortgage payments, wanting to make sure that the mortgage gets paid on time, that can be seen as a violation of the injunction. So make sure that we're obeying the restrictions. If the injunction restricts you from going to the children's school or daycare to pick them up, you need to abide by that. If the injunction says that you lost possession of the pets, the fur babies, on a temporary basis, you need to abide by that provision. And finally, one of the provisions that is usually or typically inside these injunctions is the clause that requires you to hand in all firearms. In the injunctions in Florida, that happens in every case. At that point, you realize that you have to hand in your firearm. Go to the police department, go hand it in there, make sure that you are complying with what the restrictions are in the injunction. So number 3 on our do consider list is do consider contacting an attorney as soon as possible. Now, are these domestic violence injunction cases something that someone can represent themselves on or defend themselves on? Absolutely. However, is it the smartest thing to do? Well, let's consider about what the consequences may be, especially in the employment sector. Prospective or future employers, when they are thinking about hiring someone, they will run a background check on them. And if they see that there's a permanent injunction for domestic violence against them, they may not hire them. Or anyone who's in the law enforcement field, like police officers, FBI agents, or Border Patrol. A lot of times these injunctions will prohibit them from carrying firearms, essentially disqualifying them from working at their job, and it may cause them to lose their jobs. What about people who are in the educational field? Teachers or counselors or principals. If there's an injunction for protection against domestic violence against them, they may also face the prospect of losing their jobs. Also, people in the medical field, whether it be doctors, nurses, or in the mental health field, like counselors, it will be very difficult for them to keep their jobs if they have an injunction for protection against domestic violence against them. And finally, for those people who are awaiting their immigration paperwork, having an injunction for protection against domestic violence may be cause for the immigration court to either deny their request to stay in this country or remove them from this country altogether. So what can an attorney do that would help alleviate this issue? Well, the attorney can jump on the case right away and try to defend from the beginning whether or not the injunction should be permanent. They can conduct discovery depositions of the person who is petitioning for the injunction. They could subpoena phone records. They could subpoena text messages. They can pull social media information to try to see if they can prove the allegations are not true. They can also subpoena witnesses. They could subpoena police reports and body cam footage and security camera footage from the different locations that some of these incidents may have allegedly occurred, but there may be proof in all of this evidence that the person asking for the injunction isn't telling the truth. These are all things that attorneys are very adept at and could help tremendously when a person is facing a case for an injunction for protection against domestic violence. The 4th item on the do list is do gather evidence to defend yourself. The way I like to phrase it is prepare to defend yourself. That means that the person who has the injunction issued against them should be gathering emails, text messages, phone logs, witness statements, security footage. If they have GPS history on their phone and it contradicts some of the allegations in the petition for domestic violence injunction, make sure that information is shared with their attorney or with the court. There should be screenshots taken of the spouse who has asked the court for the injunction, either messaging the other spouse or fighting with the other spouse, because that proves that they're really not afraid or they're not in fear of being victims of domestic violence. And this is information that can be used in court. It is very important for the person who has the domestic violence injunction issued against them to start getting the documentation and proof necessary for court. Now, the 5th and final thing that a person served with a domestic violence injunction during court should consider is do prepare for the court hearing. First and foremost, that person should show up to court. A lot of times, if the person doesn't show up to court and they were notified, the court will enter a permanent injunction against them. Also, hopefully they've had an opportunity to prepare with their attorney and review all of the evidence that we discussed in the previous step. At that point, they will present their side of the story in court and hopefully give a compelling reason why the injunction shouldn't be issued against them if they have the proof to corroborate that. Also, a special consideration should be going out to people who have a pending criminal charge because of the circumstances regarding the domestic violence injunction. If they do, they need to consider if discussing the facts or what occurred could possibly be used against them in criminal court. Now, we're going to talk about 5 things that a person who is served with an injunction for protection against domestic violence should probably never do once they are served with that injunction. And the first one is, don't violate the order. Even if your spouse or the person who has the injunction against you contacts you or initiates contact. What do I mean by that? If they call or text you, do not respond. Because if you do, like we mentioned previously, you may get arrested, even if it's something innocuous. If there's no contact and the other spouse texts because they want to talk to you about the children, that could be a violation of the injunction. So be very careful about doing that, and be very careful of, once you receive the injunction, a lot of times the initial reaction is to text that person, to text the spouse, to try to work it out or to try to explain yourself. Don't do that. That could be a violation of the injunction, and that person may get arrested. Now, don't number 2, it's going to sound a little bit familiar, don't confront or contact the other person. I know, sounds like what I just said. Well, it is important, so I thought I'd say it twice. The person who had the injunction issued against them should not contact or try to explain to the person asking for the injunction what the issues are. That means no in-person meetups, no social media contact, or no third-party communications. This is so important because a judge who issued the injunction is not going to care that the person just tried to explain things or wanted to give their side of the story. If a person, let's say a man, thinks that he can smooth it over by sending his wife flowers or a note to work after an injunction is in place, bad idea. That man could end up in jail. Or if a woman who had an injunction issued against her by her husband calls her husband and leaves voicemails on his cell phone trying to explain or apologize, that can be seen as a violation of the injunction. If one of the spouses picks up the children when they're not supposed to because of the injunction, that can also be seen as a violation of the injunction. So no contact, no confrontation, no explanation to that person while the injunction is in place. Number 3 is, don't ignore the injunction and think that it will magically go away. Wrong! Ignoring the injunction and the corresponding paperwork, including the court dates, could be very detrimental. As I mentioned previously, if the person is served with the injunction paperwork and they don't show up to court, the judge could actually enter a permanent injunction against them, and then it's really hard to get that set aside. Now, I like to compare it to like a traffic ticket or an IRS debt. It's just going to go from bad to really worse if the person doesn't address it and confront the issue head on. Don't number 4 is to not post about the injunction on social media. In this day and age, we're all on social media posting every little thing that happens to us. Trust me, it is not a good idea to post about the current status of your injunction on social media, because anything that you put on there and anything negative that you may say either about the person who got the injunction against you or your spouse who got the injunction against you or the court system in general will be printed out by someone like me who's an attorney and will be used against that person in court. In other words, a person who has an injunction issued against them should not use this as the platform to rant and rave about the injunction or the justification for the same. Number 5 is, don't go it alone. It is important, if an injunction is issued against somebody, that they start seeking both counseling and support from their family and friends. And if they decide to go to court, strongly consider going to court with an attorney. As we have mentioned throughout this video, the stakes are extremely high when it comes to domestic violence injunctions. They can affect the amount of time that the person has with their children, because a lot of these courts throughout the country consider domestic violence as a factor when it comes to determining the best interests of the children and whether or not to allow a person to have visitation or time sharing. And they can also have the effect of prohibiting someone from having a job or possibly losing their job. And in some situations, it can have an effect where the person may not be able to become a citizen of this country. So going it alone is a hard mountain to climb, and hopefully some of these considerations will be helpful to make them consider what their options are. All right, so that's a wrap on our video regarding the 5 do's and the 5 don'ts on how to address being served with a domestic violence injunction during a divorce case. This is really tough stuff, and this is really important stuff. So hopefully some of this information was useful. If any of you know someone that could use this information, please have them look us up at www.segarralawfirm.com. We have offices in Miami and Orlando, Florida. Se habla español. Do us a favor. Please like this video, subscribe to the Divorce Broadcast, and we will be seeing you all soon. Thank you.